A lonely figure in the night. The cold wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the distant hum of sirens. The city was alive, but in a different way, one filled with the hurried footsteps of people too busy to notice the small, shivering figure curled up near the hospital entrance. A tiny, golden-furred puppy, no more than a few months old, lay curled in a tight ball on a worn-out piece of cardboard. His fur was slightly matted, his ribs faintly visible beneath his fragile body. Despite the biting cold, the little one remained there, eyes half closed as if waiting for something. Dr. Lucas Monroe had just finished another grueling shift. The exhaustion in his bones was deep, but he had long since learned to push through it. As the hospital doors slid open, allowing him to step outside, he paused. There it was again. The puppy. For the past week, every night as he left the hospital, he had seen this tiny creature lying in the same spot, unmoving, barely shifting except for the slow rise and fall of its breath. At first, he had assumed it was just a stray looking for warmth, but something about the puppy's unwavering presence unsettled him. Why here? Why this hospital? Dr. Monroe pulled his coat tighter around himself and knelt down, reaching out carefully. The puppy flinched but didn't run. Instead, it simply opened its deep brown eyes that held something far too human. Pain, loss, a silent plea. He hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but an overwhelming sadness filled his chest as he looked at the creature. Shaking his head, he sighed and pulled a protein bar from his pocket, tearing a small piece and placing it on the ground. "Here, buddy," he whispered. The puppy sniffed at it hesitantly before slowly licking at the crumbs. "You've been here every night, haven't you?" he mused aloud, more to himself than to the animal. "What are you waiting for?" But the puppy didn't answer. It only lowered its head and curled back into itself. Dr. Monroe exhaled, rubbing his temples. He knew he couldn't take the puppy home. He barely had time for himself. But something about the way it lingered here every night, something about the sadness in its eyes wouldn't let him walk away. He turned back toward the hospital, glancing up at the brightly lit windows. Somewhere inside, there was a connection. He didn't know how, but this puppy wasn't just lost. It was waiting for something, or someone, and Dr. Monroe was determined to find out why. A name in the darkness. Dr. Lucas Monroe couldn't shake the image of the little puppy from his mind. The way it lay there night after night, unwavering, as if it belonged to something or someone inside the hospital. He had seen strays before, but this was different. There was purpose in the puppy's sadness, and it gnawed at him. The next night, as Lucas stepped outside after another long shift, he wasn't surprised to find the small golden figure curled up on the same piece of cardboard. The puppy lifted its head weakly, as if recognizing him. "You again," Lucas murmured, crouching beside the dog. This time, he had come prepared. From his pocket, he pulled out a small packet of wet dog food he had bought from the convenience store on the way in. Peeling it open, he placed it on the ground. The puppy hesitated before inching forward, sniffing the food. Then, slowly, it started eating, small bites at first, as if afraid the meal would disappear. Lucas ran a tired hand through his dark hair, sighing. "You have an owner, don't you?" he whispered. "You're waiting for them." The puppy paused, lifting its deep brown eyes to meet his, and for a moment, Lucas could swear it understood him. He glanced back at the hospital. Somewhere inside, there was a missing piece to this puzzle. The next day, curiosity got the better of him. Before his shift, he went to the hospital security desk. The guards knew him well, and when he inquired about the puppy, they nodded in recognition. "Yeah, we've noticed it too," one of the older guards, Carl, said. "It showed up about 2 weeks ago. Won't leave. Just stays there all night, then disappears in the morning." Lucas frowned. "Disappears where?" Carl shrugged. "No idea. Comes back every night, same spot. Sad little thing. Do you have security footage?" Carl hesitated before nodding. We do, but I doubt it'll show you anything new. That dog's been sitting outside the ER entrance for weeks. Lucas leaned in. Can you check? Maybe we can figure out where it came from. After a moment, Carl pulled up the footage. Lucas watched as the grainy black and white security film rewound, night after night, showing the same heartbreaking scene. The puppy arriving at dusk, curling up on the cardboard, staying all night, leaving at dawn. It never left its spot for long. It never chased cars or wandered the streets like a normal stray. It just waited. Lucas felt something tighten in his chest. Then, something changed. "Wait!" he said suddenly. "Go back!" Carl rewound the footage. Lucas squinted at the screen. 2 weeks ago, on the night the puppy had first arrived, a woman had been wheeled into the ER on a stretcher. She was unconscious, her face barely visible beneath the oxygen mask. A paramedic rushed alongside her, and just behind them, a small golden puppy trotted after the stretcher, its tail wagging slightly before the ER doors shut in its face. Lucas's stomach dropped. The puppy had followed her here, and it had never left. "Who is she?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carl typed something into the system. "Let's see. That was March 3rd. She was admitted under Claire Mitchell." He clicked his tongue. "Still here. Room 214. Lucas felt his breath hitch. The puppy wasn't just waiting. It was waiting for Claire, and she had no idea. Lucas stood outside room 214, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't quite explain. The name Claire Mitchell meant nothing to him, yet. But the puppy outside, the way it waited night after night, told him that whoever she was, she mattered. He inhaled deeply, then knocked. A moment later, a soft voice answered. "Come in." Lucas pushed the door open to find a woman lying in the hospital bed, propped up against white pillows. Claire Mitchell looked fragile, pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, but there was warmth in her expression despite the evident exhaustion. She smiled faintly when she saw him. "Doctor?" Lucas cleared his throat. I'm Dr. Monroe. I wasn't your attending physician, but..." He hesitated, unsure how to phrase it. "I need to ask you something. Do you own a dog?" Claire's tired eyes widened in surprise. "A dog?" Lucas nodded. "A small golden puppy. It's been waiting outside the hospital every night since you were admitted." For a moment, Claire just stared at him. Then, to his shock, her lips trembled and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Charlie?" she whispered. The name sent a shiver down Lucas's spine. Claire lifted a trembling hand to cover her mouth. "He's still there?" Lucas nodded. "Every night." A choked sob escaped her lips. She turned her head to the side, blinking rapidly as tears spilled onto her cheeks. Lucas pulled a chair closer. "Claire, can you tell me what happened?" She took a shaky breath, composing herself before speaking. "Charlie. He was a stray when I found him. Just a tiny thing, wandering outside my apartment building. He was starving, scared. I fed him, gave him a home. And in return..." Her lips quivered into a sad smile. "He gave me his whole heart." Lucas swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. Claire exhaled. 2 weeks ago, I had a seizure while walking home. I barely remember it. I just remember falling, and then darkness." She sniffled. "The doctors told me I collapsed in the street, and someone called an ambulance." Lucas felt his chest tighten. "Charlie must have followed you all the way here." A fresh wave of tears filled her eyes. "He's been waiting for me this whole time?" Lucas nodded. Claire broke down completely, covering her face with her hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lucas allowed her to grieve, to process, and then finally she wiped at her eyes and whispered, "I need to see him." Lucas hesitated. "You're still under observation, Claire. You're not strong enough to—" "Please," she pleaded. "He doesn't know why I disappeared. He's been waiting alone in the cold, thinking I abandoned him. He's just a baby." Her voice cracked. "I need him." Lucas felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just a doctor at this moment. He was a witness to something far greater, a bond that defied time, logic, and suffering, a bond of unconditional love. Finally, he exhaled. "Okay." Claire looked at him, hope flickering in her exhausted eyes. "I'll bring Charlie to you," Lucas promised. The relief that washed over her face was instant, and so, with determination settling deep in his chest, Dr. Lucas Monroe walked out of room 214, ready to reunite a lost soul with the only family he had ever known. The night air was crisp as Dr. Lucas Monroe stepped outside the hospital. His eyes scanned the entrance, searching for the familiar golden figure curled up near the doors. And there he was. Charlie lay in his usual spot, his tiny body curled into a ball, his fur ruffled by the wind. His ears perked up at the sound of footsteps, but he didn't lift his head, almost as if hope had started to fade. Lucas felt his throat tighten. He crouched beside the puppy. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Charlie barely reacted at first. His tail gave the smallest flick, but his movements were sluggish, as though exhaustion had finally caught up with him. Lucas reached out slowly, gently running a hand over the puppy's thin body. He was small, too small. He had likely been eating scraps for days, surviving on little more than hope and instinct. "You don't have to wait anymore," Lucas murmured. "She's waiting for you this time." Charlie's ears twitched, and for the first time, he lifted his head slightly. Lucas carefully reached into his pocket, pulling out a soft cloth he had taken from the hospital, one that carried Claire's scent. He held it close to Charlie's nose. The reaction was instant. The little pup stiffened, his nose twitching rapidly. Then, suddenly, he let out a high-pitched whimper, one filled with recognition. His eyes darted up to Lucas, desperate, questioning. Lucas smiled softly. "Come on, let's go see her." He scooped Charlie up in his arms, feeling the frail body tremble slightly against him. The puppy didn't resist. Instead, he snuggled closer, as if understanding that something was finally about to change. The walk through the hospital halls was quiet, save for the faint padding of Lucas's footsteps and the soft whimpers escaping Charlie's tiny mouth. Nurses gave him puzzled looks, but none questioned him. Somehow, it felt like everyone sensed this was something important. When they reached room 214, Lucas hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open. Claire was sitting upright, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her entire body tense with anticipation. The moment her eyes landed on the small golden bundle in Lucas's arms, a broken sob escaped her lips. "Charlie!" Charlie's head snapped toward the voice, his entire body tensed. Then, a frantic struggle. Charlie twisted in Lucas's arms, his tiny paws scrambling against his chest. Lucas barely had time to lower him before the puppy leapt from his grasp, sprinting across the room with every ounce of energy he had left. Claire barely had time to brace herself before Charlie jumped onto the hospital bed, throwing his tiny body against her. The sound he made, half whimper, half cry, was unlike anything Lucas had ever heard. It was pure relief. Claire let out a broken, tearful laugh as she wrapped her arms around the little dog, holding him close against her chest. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Charlie licked at her face, nuzzling into her neck, his tiny body trembling with joy. His tail wagged so hard it shook his entire frame, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. It was as if he were making sure she was real, making sure she wouldn't disappear again. Lucas turned away slightly, giving them a moment. Something in his chest ached, a bittersweet feeling he couldn't quite name. For 2 weeks, Charlie had braved the cold, the loneliness, the uncertainty. He had waited, because in his heart there had never been a doubt. His person would come back to him. And now she finally had. Claire buried her face into Charlie's fur, tears soaking into his golden coat. "I love you, baby," she whispered. "I love you so much." Charlie responded with another desperate lick, his tiny body pressing as close to hers as possible. Lucas swallowed the lump in his throat. This was love. The kind that didn't waver. The kind that didn't give up. The kind that never stopped waiting. As he turned to leave the room, giving them privacy, he caught one last glimpse of the little puppy curled safely in Claire's arms, his tail wagging even in his sleep. For the first time in weeks, he was at peace. He had found his way home. The next morning, Lucas found himself stopping by room 214 again, unable to ignore the pull in his chest. Through the small window in the door, he saw Claire sitting up, looking healthier than she had the day before. And in her lap, curled up in the warm nest of hospital blankets, was Charlie. Lucas knocked softly before stepping inside. Claire looked up at him, her eyes still puffy from crying, but her smile was genuine. "Good morning, Doctor." Lucas gave her a small smile. "How's our little warrior doing?" Claire looked down at Charlie, who was fast asleep, his tiny body rising and falling with steady breaths. She ran her fingers gently through his fur. "He hasn't let go of me all night," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I've slept this peacefully in a long time." Lucas sat on the edge of the chair beside her bed. "He was waiting for you." Claire nodded, tears pooling in her eyes again. "I keep thinking about how scared he must have been, alone out there, not knowing if I was ever coming back." She sniffled, tightening her arms around Charlie. And yet, he never left. Lucas exhaled deeply. "Animals understand more than we give them credit for. He knew you were still here. He just needed to wait." Claire let out a shaky breath. "I never thought I'd mean so much to someone. But Charlie," she gently stroked the puppy's ear, "he's my family." Lucas nodded, understanding in a way he hadn't expected. Love like that doesn't fade. A comfortable silence settled between them, the weight of emotions filling the air. Finally, Lucas cleared his throat. "You'll be discharged in a few days, but Charlie," he hesitated. "He needs care too. He's underweight, and I don't think he's been eating properly. He's resilient, but he's been through a lot." Claire swallowed hard, guilt flashing in her eyes. "I'll take care of him. Whatever he needs, I'll do it." Lucas smiled. "I figured you'd say that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small packet of dog treats. A little something to start. Claire laughed softly, taking the treats from him. "Thank you, Dr. Monroe, for everything." Lucas shook his head. "I didn't do anything." "You did more than you know," Claire said. "You gave Charlie back to me." Lucas watched as she held Charlie close, the tiny puppy sighing contentedly in his sleep. In the world of medicine, Lucas had seen his fair share of miracles. But this was something else. This was love in its purest form. As he walked out of the room, he glanced back one last time at the woman who had survived against the odds and the little dog who had never given up on her. And for the first time in a long while, Doctor. Lucas Monroe felt something warm settle in his chest. Somewhere in the chaos of life, in the heartbreak and the healing, he had just witnessed something rare, a love that never wavered, a love that never left, and that, more than anything, was worth believing in.